Ladies and gentlemen, signori e signori, good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this second lecture by Professor Giovanni Aloi within the series Voci della Natura, dedicated to the representation of nature and ecology in visual arts, in Italian visual arts of the 20th and 21st century. I would like to welcome once again Professor Aloi. Thank you, Giovanni, and welcome. I know that many of you are very familiar with Giovanni, but for the others, I would like to remind that Professor Giovanni Aloi is an author, an educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature in art. He has published with Columbia University Press, Phaidon, MIT, Laurence King, and Prestel. He has as well contributed to BBC radio programs, work at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London, and he is USA correspondent for Esse Magazine and a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago. Professor Aloi has curated exhibitions in the US and Europe. He currently teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art, New York and London. So once again, welcome Giovanni, and thank you very much for cooperating with the Italian Cultural Institute. Well, I would just, before leaving the floor to Giovanni, I would like to remind what brought us here. First of all, the celebration of the 30 years from the passing of Italian photographer Luigi Ghirri. And also we are keeping a promise that Giovanni and I made with all of you last year as we were when Giovanni was holding a series of lectures dedicated to the history of photography, of Italian photography. We happened to talk about Luigi Ghirri. We both discovered our passion for its images and its art and his art, and we decided that we would hold a conversation dedicated only to Luigi Ghirri. And tonight's event fits perfectly, not only within the series of lectures that now Giovanni is holding for the Italian Cultural Institute, but also within the general focus that we as Italian Cultural Institute are making this year on the representation of art, nature, and of climate crisis seen through the perspective of arts in Italy. We have just broadcasted live 5 documentaries in cooperation with Milano Design Film Festival dedicated to the relation between human beings and nature. And later in April, we'll have the third lecture of Professor Aloi, but also we will start a series of lectures and conversation more focused on science and on how different fields of science are facing these issues. Therefore, I'm sure you will all enjoy, will be fascinated by not only by the image of Luigi Ghirri, but also by the presentation that Giovanni will give us tonight. Of course, as usual, I invite all of you to interact with us at the end of the conversation by typing your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Thank you all. Giovanni, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Luca. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, as always. Thank you all for coming. And it's a great pleasure to spend best part of an hour talking about Luigi Ghirri, and especially to focus on a specific aspect of his work, because the photographic work of Luigi Ghirri encompasses much more than the subject of ecology and nature. And I actually think that tonight we're trying something different from the conventional readings of the body of work of Luigi Ghirri that I have encountered so far. Because as part of this series, we are focusing on conceptions of ecology in Italian art, and especially on pioneers of Italian art and ecology. And so this will not be a comprehensive talk on the body of work of Luigi Ghirri, but it will focus specifically on some projects and some images in which this unique photographer engaged with the subject of nature in a way that was in many ways utterly contemporary for the time in which he lived, and also looking forward to, let's say, anticipating problematics, conversations, and discourses that have become topical only during the past 20 years. So I really see Ghirri as a very important pioneer of the history of photography and ecology, and his influence in both ecological representations or ecologically concerned representations, as well as photography more in general, is today being acknowledged in Italy as well as internationally. So tonight we will focus on selected works, and I will spend more time on one of his series that is very dear to me, that I'm going to introduce briefly. But before, I just wanted to give you a snapshot, some information that will help you understanding why the photography of Luigi Ghirri is so original, so different, and why we look at his work as pioneering, as groundbreaking approaches to the representation of the complex relationship between nature and culture. So Luigi Ghirri was born in 1943 in Scandiano, which is a relatively small town between Modena and Reggio Emilia in Emilia-Romagna. And by trade, he was a land surveyor. So in this sense, being a land surveyor, using photography for a purpose that it's professional and not necessarily artistic, lays the foundation of Ghirri's photographic approach to the image. And I'm sure that tonight, as we explore his photographic lexicon, the idea of his professional trade, being a land surveyor, comes back. And at the same time, it's disrupted by this artistic charge, this will to create images that are simultaneously documentations. Perhaps we could even go so far as to say objective documentations of something, even when the word objective becomes, of course, a slippery slope. And at the same time, interpretative, in a way that I like to express as a light touch. There is a sense of respect in what Ghirri does with representation, a relational, through which a nuanced sense of distance and closeness is fine-tuned through the image. Luigi Ghirri embraced photography in 1970, and by 1975, he was featured in Life magazine in a portfolio of new discoveries, discovery of the year. And you can imagine that that radically changed his career and catapulted his work onto the international scene. So if you like, the history of Luigi Ghirri is a history of instant success, and yet it's a slow burning journey. It's a slow burning process of refinement, of a very personal aesthetic that initially could be dismissed as perhaps too simplistic, superficial, unemotional, and that instead, project after project reveals itself as a deep philosophical consideration of our relationship with reality through photography, and in the case of what we're exploring tonight, especially with our relationship with nature. Not only Ghirri was a successful photographer, but he was also a a teacher and a writer. And I certainly recommend his books to you. The way in which he wrote about photography, his understanding of photography is extremely erudite and it's extremely complex. You could really see analogies and aspects of the idiom of photography that have become commonplace today, but again, in the 1970s were not. We have to remember that in the 1970s, across the world, photography is still fighting to become an art form, an acknowledged art form, like painting, like sculpture. Still today, we encounter detractors who claim that photography is not an art form like photography, like painting and sculpture. But at the time, the marginalization of photography as an art form was substantial. So for Ghirri to persevere with an aesthetic that, in a sense, is deliberately quiet, subtle, and that an aesthetic that renounces any dramatization, any sublime, any easy access that is spectacular or that can be confused with entertainment. It's almost like a stoic determination to carry on and carry on, following his own path, following his own intuition, until the world realizes this is worth focusing on. So the book I'd like to begin with, and it's the book that I am particularly attached to and that I want to focus on more tonight, is Colazione sull'erba, which I have right here. It's a beautiful book that was published as a compendium of the images that are part of the series Colazione sull'erba, which translates as breakfast on the grass. And it's Ghirri's masterclass on the photography of plants. The title might ring a bell. I'm sure that many of you thought immediately of Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe and the idea of the scandal, the inappropriateness of this representation in the Salon of 1863 in Paris, which caused an uproar because of the very bourgeois attitudes that he portrayed and that it betrayed. There is something fascinating about this scene which reveals the frolicking in the woods that was happening at the time in Paris, practiced by well-to-do gentlemen, and the implication of prostitution, the breaking of values, and the representation of taboos that should remain unspoken. And this journey that Ghirri undertakes in the Italian suburbia, and especially the Italian suburbia around Modena. There is something really important we will explore today about the moment, the historical moment in which Luigi Ghirri explores the scenery, the suburbia, the Italian suburbia at a precise moment after the Second World War, and the relationship between a new bourgeoisie that's growing in Italy and the aesthetics that he explores in order to understand or represent a certain psychological predisposition, a certain way of living, and a certain set of values. Of course, in the context of the bourgeoisie and the painting that we see here, there is this desire of the return to nature at a time in which the Industrial Revolution was changing the lives of so many individuals who lived in cities that were becoming dirtier, busier, and more polluted. And this idea of returning to nature in this painting, which is associated with sex, it's associated with a letting go of societal norm, transfers into Ghirri's series, but in a way that it's extremely different. So I'm going to show you some of the images that are part of this series so that we can understand more fully what is special about Ghirris Aesthetics and what makes Ghirri such a reference point in the history and the practices of contemporary photography. Plants, a subject that it's dear to me. Those of you who have had the opportunity to follow my research on the subject know that I've published more than one book on the representation of plants in the history of art. And the representation of plants in art is a complicated subject for a number of reasons. First of all, we might be under the impression that we see plants everywhere, that they're around us and that we are aware of their presence all the time. Unfortunately, the opposite is true, especially in art. The subject of plants has always, since especially the 15th and 16th century, been deemed inferior to the other subjects. The human body is what is important. We touched upon some of these subjects in our last presentation. The hierarchization of genres in art that was crystallized during the 17th century places the representation of plants at the very bottom of importance. Plants are therefore seen, and yet we remain blind to what they are as beings in their own right. We see them most often as objects, objects of design or parts of architectural structures and exterior design. To see plants in contemporary art after 20 years of artists focusing on nature in new and exciting ways means to go past the tradition of botanical illustration in the West and the classical approaches of still life painting in the West in order to access different ways in which we might represent plants without imposing upon them specific anthropocentric symbolism. What am I talking about? Anthropocentric symbolism is a tradition in Western art through which we attach human feelings, emotions, and meanings to plants. For instance, in the tradition of still life painting, beautiful bunches of flowers, roses, poppies, daisies, violets, every flower is represented in image because it carries a symbolic meaning that can be decoded by the audience, by the viewer. So when we stare at a still life painting from the 17th or the 18th century, we might be looking at a daisy or a poppy or a rose, but instead we are looking at the symbol of love, the symbol of sleep, the symbol of reincarnation, the symbol of love and simplicity. So what does it mean to use plants as carriers of anthropocentric symbolism? It means to remain blind to what plants ultimately are. Because every time we apply a symbolic reading to a plant, the painting is asking us to look at the plant, but in reality, it's asking us to look away simultaneously and to consider something that is wholly human. So one of the things Ghirri does particularly well in this series of photographs of plants in the suburbia of Modena is to avoid any symbolic meaning. The plants that we see in Ghirri's photographs are potted plants of any kind that was popular at this specific moment between 1972 and 1974 in the suburbia around Modena. And as you can see, in Ghirri's aesthetic, the plant is situated in a very, again, I would like to use the term respectful way, which might also sound perhaps inappropriate in the sense that when I say respectful, I feel that Ghirri is trying to retain in the representation something that is specific of the enigmatic presence of plants. Plants seem to just sit there when they are placed in a pot, when they're no longer part of the ecosystems that they belong to. They are extracted and become suspended between the ideas of architecture, design, and nature. And this seeming static being, because we know that plants move, we know that plants constantly evolve and shift in their being, nonetheless is frozen further by photography. And Ghirri seems to never want to interfere by rendering these plants in dramatic ways, heroic ways, ways that suggest a level of empathy with the plant that might fake this encounter. My impression is that Ghirri, through his photographs, is staging an encounter with plants in what has become their new environment. Now, if you're good with your botanical knowledge, you might recognize some of these plants. And at that point, if you recognize these plants, you might also begin to see how the artificiality of the scene has multiple layers. Not only these plants appeared somehow lost in these concrete jungles, in these scenarios in which grass is even absent. You know, it's I think the title of the series is paradoxical, it's Breakfast on the Grass, and grass is really what we don't get to see in Ghirri's photographs. The plants appeared in a pot, on the ground, on a table, and they seem to sometimes not even be the central focus of the picture. What we see is a de-heroicization of the plant. The plant is there. Does the plant have anything to say symbolically? No. In this case, we find an agave. Some of you know that agaves require a much warmer climate. Agaves grow in the south of Italy, they grow in Greece, and of course in South America. So for an agave, which grows to a certain size, right? Sometimes even 6 or 7 feet across, and can live up to 30 or 40 years, to be in a pot like the kind we see here next to a door on a sidewalk seems oxymoronic, seem somewhat part of a containment of vegetal life that makes no sense. And yet it's what we all do. Pots become very enigmatic in the work of Ghirri, like in the case of this aspidistra. Aspidistra is another plant that doesn't carry any symbolic meaning in the history of botanical, in the history of classical painting. And you can see here again how Ghirri approaches the image in a seemingly cold-hearted way. And when I say cold-hearted, I don't mean that he doesn't care. He cares to take this picture and provide an encounter that is somewhat distant enough that his own interpretation of the scene doesn't occlude the being, the enigmatic being of the plant. That's what I mean by this respect. Sometimes in order to respect something or somebody, you need that distance. You need to be able to let them be what they appear to be without manipulating them. You can imagine how he could have decided to take a more dramatic angle, do a close-up, maybe focus on the shininess of the leaf. And instead, he just pulls back. And it's at that moment of the pulling back that the presence of the plant becomes tangible. This idea that the plant is there, it's living, and yet it's not doing anything that we can perceive. It's the static presence suspended between the architectural, the design, and the natural. That being suspended becomes the emblem, not just of what Ghirri is doing photographically, but what he's trying to represent. Is Colazione sull'erba a book about plants? Is it a book about the suburbia around Modena? Or is it a book about something bigger in which plants play a very important role? And we're going to explore this today through this work and others by Ghirri. One of the things you may have noticed about the aesthetics that Ghirri deploys in almost every picture is a sense of frontality. He tends to use a one-point perspective to avoid drama and to create a sense of flatness. This flatness is very important in Ghirri's work on multiple levels. Ghirri is extremely erudite, as I mentioned earlier, about photography as a medium. He uses photography, takes photographs in order to understand what the idiom of photography is in the time in which he lives. It is a waste of time to talk about photography and the idiom of photography, what the characteristics of photography are as a medium in a generic sense. Because the idiom of photography, what photography can do and how photography can do it, changes depending on when the photographs are taken and what the intentions of the photographer are. Of course, there are aspects of the idiom that remain immutable. Like, for instance, when we think about the stilling of time, we can argue that all of photography, regardless of the chemistry and the technology, is concerned with the stilling, with the freezing of time. And yet, if this freezing of time is all that photography do, then we're missing the point. I think that Ghirri is actually engaging with a complex and psychological conception of time that has a lot to do with the specific historical moment that Italy is going through. How time is experienced by the plants that we see here, how time is experienced by the people, the Italians who live in Italy at this moment, and how time is made to unfold through different representations, through different media, the filmic medium, the photographic medium, which are the new psychoanalytical introspective media of the Second World War, the aftermath of the Second World War. We have sort of moved on from that relationship with film and photography. But Ghirri, I think, is completely imbued in a very elemental, in a very tangible question of time, how to represent it beyond its passing, and how to represent time as a collective psychological dimension through these photographs. So back to his aesthetic recurring traits, I'm sure you've already noticed the grids. There are many grids in Ghirri's photographs. There are horizontal and vertical lines intersecting. There is a sense of nature being trapped. Even in the topiary, you can see how this cute little tree somewhat appears too young. There is a sense of this tree being out of place and being somewhat compressed into a space that it's not necessarily congenial to its growth and its well-being. And in part, this sense of constriction is a symptom of the psychological dimension represented and inhabited by the suburbia of this time. This is something that those of you who are Italian here today, and those of you who are my age or a little bit older than me, or even as old as Luca, might remember. I experienced this as a child, and I always found particularly suffocating. It was a sense of anxiety that would take hold of me whenever my parents had to drive someplace to visit a relative or to get to a warehouse, a shop, and they had to get to a place in the suburbia. There is something about the suburbia as periphery of the city, which in Italy stands in diametrical opposition to a vision of Italy as the touristic destination. The suburbia doesn't have history. And from an Italian perspective, from the Italian identity construct as a national identity construct, the suburbia is alien or instills a sense of alienation between humans and humans, humans and nature. humans and the built environment. The built environment of suburbia is instantaneous, is geometric, it's cold, it's rational, it's modern, and at the same time, it seems to have squeezed out all the life out of itself. And when I say squeezed out, I really mean even out of the lives of those who live there. There's a sense of abandonment that it's not necessarily reflected in a feeling of rundown. The buildings are not run down. The streets are clean. Perhaps they're too clean. There's a sense of artificiality that troubles those who live in the suburbia and those who experience it. And it's this artificiality in which plants become almost like a disturbance. Plants become this presence that should not be there. There's a constant sense of wrong placeness in these images. And the question really is, who is in the wrong place? The whole of the suburbia is perhaps the wrong place for anything to be in. And yet it's the result of the economic boom and a moment in the history of Italy in which a certain economic prosperity led to the suburbia to grow, perhaps faster than these plants could catch up with. This is one of the parts I find fascinating about this book. It's how the plants look young, right? The plants look like they don't have history themselves. So we return to the point of time and how time in these photographs is a psychological conception of the suburbia in itself. It's not having a history. It's being stuck in a present that it's lacking a promise of a better future. There's a feeling that the suburbia will not have anything else to offer from what it offers right in that very moment. And these plants appear to be stuck in this present. They are immobile. They seem to be contained by the architectural features. The straight lines, the vertical lines, the horizontal lines, geometrical features that create a rationalization, a geometrical rationalization of culture, a human environment. And then lighting. One of the things I find really fascinating about Ghirri's approach to lighting is a desire to avoid, again, any kind of dramatization or any kind of high contrast or too colorful juxtaposition that might distract the viewer. There's a baseline and there's a thinness to these images. There's a uniformity. And Ghirri, again, was a pioneer in the sense that he rejected the idea that photographers must use expensive equipment as well as expensive studios, which can process your images and adjust the contrast or the saturations in a way that might fake a certain fine-tuning of the encounter. So for instance, Ghirri used to develop and print his photographs at the kind of high street environment, you know, a high street establishment that we've all been in many years ago, especially in the 1980s when everyone was still using analog films. You just take it to the chemists, you just take it to one of those cheap photographic shops that sells glasses as well as cameras and contact lenses, and they would just turn around your photographs in a week, or even like the supermarket. So Ghirri is not concerned with the high end of photography. And he really employs a desaturation of color. He's very interested in how reducing your color range can make us focus on these images as metaphors of a psychological state, rather than documentations of an encounter. And you can see an attention to detail. You can see an attention to textures, but there's a profound sense of loneliness in these images as well. And again, it's all hinged around this enigmatic presence of the plant. this idea of how plants are objectified, how plants are, in a sense, marginalized because of their silence, and how plants, in a sense, always constantly pose questions about communication implicitly. Those of you who are plant lovers, some of you may even talk to their plants, know what I mean when you think about the difficulty to access what's wrong with a plant whose leaves are turning yellow. And this impossibility to get past that moment, and yet the desire to do what you can to make the plant happy. And yet we know that plants communicate among themselves in ways that we cannot detect. In this, there's also a metaphor that expands well beyond the vegetal world, and that I think Ghirri's interest in the situation of these plants in the Italian suburbia of the 1970s brings to the fore a much broader issue, a much deeper crisis that it's represented in these beautiful images. You see, once again, a massive agave that's clearly feeling a little suffocated and a little constricted in a pot that is too large to contain its growth. And these shutters as well, you probably noticed, I want to point out, there's quite a few shutters in Ghirri's photographs, and they're always pulled down. Of course, there are no people. This is, to me, a great relief. When photographers, the biggest photographers in the history of the past century especially, were the photographers of the human, portraits, the nude, again, all these stereotypes that painting brought us came back through photography. And to actually see a photographer like Ghirri shunning people and looking around for plants, looking around for objects to position, also makes him a pioneer. He's decentralizing the human in his practice. And he's trying to think about broader issues involved in the sense of alienation that define life in Italy at this point. And again, back to the sense of loneliness, the sense of sadness, the sense of out of placeness. You can see how, in this case, this topiary, it's so accurate and perfect, perhaps a little ridiculous for this setting, and yet the tree is growing through the fence in this photograph specifically. So there's, again, this sense of containment, this sense of spilling out, this sense of wanting to compress and restrict, which, again, has something to do with the Italian suburbia of the time and the condition in which those who inhabit it thrive or not. Ghirri poses an interesting question about whether these plants are thriving or not, or whether they're just surviving at a time that it's the aftermath of a very important moment in the history of Italian development after the Second World War, which goes by the name Miracolo Italiano. The Miracolo Italiano was the boom after the Second World War, economic boom that led to a sense of freedom and independence across the peninsula. Of course, certain centers being privileged in that context, especially the cities in the north. There was a sense of experimentation in the arts, and even that a revolution could be possible. Of course, the revolution is fueled by capitalism, and it ends in a disillusion that Ghirri captures in the photographs that we have just seen. So when we start to contextualize his representation of plants in the suburbia within this historic milieu of Italian, Italian second post-war period, then we start to see a bigger picture. These are films that I certainly recommend you watch if you haven't watched them already, by Michelangelo Antonioni. These are extremely interesting in their own right, but in the context of what I'm presenting tonight, to me, they became particularly interesting because of an analogy I noticed between the way in which Antonioni represented plants in these films. Now, together, L'Avventura, La Notte, and L'Eclisse are considered to be part of a trilogy. and it's the trilogy of incommunicability. I found that particularly interesting because to me, communicability and incommunicability were the currents, the undercurrents of the photographs that Ghirri has taken throughout his career, but also that Ghirri has taken especially in the Colazione sull'erba. And if you watch these films, especially I have to say La Notte and L'Eclisse, you will become aware of this sense of an incommunicability that plays out among the main characters. They have everything. They live in comfort, in homes situated in the suburbia of big cities in Italy, and yet they seem completely lost. They seem completely incapable of snapping out of a psychological sense of torpor that in a sense is represented by the plants we see in Ghirri's photographs too. These plants are captive of their own condition. They are stuck in places in which they have been put and from which they cannot escape. And this constriction turns into a kind of neurosis. It turns into an impossibility to be fulfilled and to be happy. And we see that in the relationships that unfold in these movies. Let's not also forget that this is the moment in which Italy gives us arte povera. So the early concerns about something going wrong in the balance between history, nature, and culture in Italy is explored by artists like Marisa Merz, Pistoletto, Giuseppe Pennone, through works of art in which nature and culture, this dichotomy that we know today can no longer be attained, appears in very haunting ways. And plants, of course, are central to this because plants are the mobile mark, placeholder of what we intend as nature and what we think of as nature in places where nature can no longer exist. You can see here again the representation of an agricultural development by Cunellis. Now, Antonioni in 1962 said, if man is today more alone, it's because communication has become more difficult. In my opinion, this happens because we can't find our bearings in this environment. Maybe this uneasiness rests in the fact that technology has progressed at such an alarming rate. And I think in this quote, I find something really interesting because the suburbia in Italy at this time is the quintessential manifestation of this speed. Again, we're going back to time. The idea that technology has progressed at such an alarming rate that has enabled us to build so quickly living solutions that are not designed for healthy living is the root of a crisis that I personally think impacted Italy in a colossal way. It's a crisis that consumes itself on different levels of depth, with the ideas of a loss of values, with the idea of a loss of purpose, a loss of integrity and disconnectedness between the history of the country and the reality, the present reality of the country, as well as a lack of faith and trust in the future. So I just wanted to show you some stills from Michelangelo Antonioni's films so you can actually see how plants are represented. You can see these hydrangeas here. Like in the photographs by Ghirri, they're small. Usually hydrangeas become big bushes, but these have probably been planted recently in this suburban reality, and they look out of place. They look constricted. They somehow seem to echo the feeling, the mood, the anxiety, the disconnectedness, the inability to communicate that we see in the characters. And Antonioni, like Ghirri, explores this relationship between these younger plants and architecture that we see, always denying a possibility. You can see how frames, like in Ghirri's work, are constraining plants, isolating them, boxing them, And again, the juxtaposition of vegetation and geometrical structures and lines, as we see here in the Eclisse. Antonioni is not afraid of revealing the manicuring, the tending to a landscape that is new, a landscape that is unfinished, buildings that are still under construction, vegetation that exists around unfinished structures that seem abandoned. There seems to be, there's scaffolding around this building, but there doesn't seem to be any activity. Like Ghirri, Antonioni plays with this notion of a desolate suburbia in which there is really nothing to do. Dormitory neighborhoods in which people migrate in the morning and evenings, coming and going, but not forming a community in these areas. So again, the idea of isolation and the idea of incommunicability. And Ghirri understood these ideas and the feeling. He was deeply immersed in the sense of alienation that Italy was experiencing on the individual as well as the national scale. And he said of his work that what he's doing is not representing, is not documenting, and it's not interpreting in that kind of sentimental way, as much as it is an imprecise cartography or a sentimental geography. So what is sentimental about geography? What is an imprecise cartography? Sentimental is not quite the same as emotional, is not quite the same as something that draws you in because it instills a sense of empathy or a sense of admiration. There is, however, and I can feel it too, a sentimental relationship within this, with this alienation that Ghirri is representing now. And maybe that's easier to experience once you move away from Italy and those places don't haunt you with that kind of sense of hollow presence, that sense of silence as well. This is another quality that we find in Ghirri's photograph that I also see in Antonioni's film. You know, Michelangelo Antonioni's films have these extended moments of silence in which, you know, silence becomes deafening in a sense. You can't stand it anymore at some point. The same happens in Ghirri's photographs. You can see people are always very small. It's hard to tell what they're going through, and objects become emblematic. They acquire a charge, they acquire a sense of presence and a sense of, they become undeniable. They're there, and the question is, what do you want from them? What is this relationship? And of course, Ghirri is at the forefront as well as understanding nature in a very contemporary way, the conceptions that have become contemporary only recently. So Ghirri is unequivocally aware of the idea that nature is constructed. Nature is not just nature. We always see nature, we take a photograph, we make a painting, and that's how we construct the idea of what is nature in our mind. So the juxtaposition of images, as we see here from another important book that he published called Kodachrome, is essential to his acknowledgement that ultimately nature in this time, in the 70s especially, but you can extend this argument to the 60s and the 80s, is the matter of advertising. You can see in this picture how the billboard, the imagery of capitalism blends in, awkwardly of course, but blends in nonetheless with the real landscape that we see right behind it. You can see how playful Ghirri is when he takes a photograph of two paintings as part of this series titled Modena, of shots he took around the city, and therefore breaks the frame. The frame is the meaning maker of art. What is within the frame makes sense. What is outside the frame should be ignored. That's what frames tell us around the painting. Look inside. And Ghirri breaks that tradition to show us somehow discordant and yet uniform and harmonious images of nature that have been fractured, that have been already painted by somebody else. Ghirri is aware that our relationship with nature is always mediated by something. Hence this sentence, this quote, the only journey possible would now appear to be within signs and images, within the destruction of direct experience. What does Ghirri mean with this? It might sound a little abstruse and a little, hyper contextualized or hyper theorized, but think about this. If you can take it as a game or an experiment. If you close your eyes and you cast your mind to the last time you were on holiday, let's say 3 years ago, before the pandemic. I know some of you had the opportunity to be on holiday more recently. And you close your eyes and you try to summon an image of a moment. Can you be 100% sure that the moment you are summoning is a moment you lived or a picture you took that is in your phone or on your computer and that you were just showing to a friend or that you looked at yourself to try and remind yourself of how beautiful that trip was? Photography is insidious because it inserts itself in our minds in ways that makes it difficult for us to be 100% sure if what's in our mind is a true memory of an experience we lived or a photograph we have seen elsewhere. And it becomes easier to distinguish the two when the photograph is really distant from the experience. But when the two begin to overlap, things become more complicated. If you want to really unsettle yourself and become particularly anxious, you can play this game about yourself. And whether if you think about a memory of when you were 3 years old, is that really a memory in your mind of when you were 3 years old? Or is it a memory of a photograph that it's in somebody's album that you return to over time? So Ghirri is aware of this impossibility of distinguish the two. Another example, you're going on holiday to Greece. Well, let's say to Italy, why not? Seems more appropriate. That's where you're going, Naples. Before you go, you look at photographs of the city, the bay, because you want to make sure that you're going to have a beautiful experience. You have already seen Naples. You have and you haven't, but you have. Once you're there, those photographs will haunt you and will not enable you to experience the city quite in the same way as if you had never seen pictures of the bay. Never quite as much as if you had never seen pictures of the city. So Ghirri takes on this idea when he begins to photograph for Atlante. Atlante is an atlas, and he photographs. This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek and like, again, a pioneering attempt at conceptual photography. He takes close-ups of an atlas and in that way represents the landscape, a landscape that he has not necessarily visited in person, but a landscape that he can access through representations, through cartography, through mapping. Even the universe, even the sky is mappable through images. And then Ghirri also abstracts these images and plays with the notion that ultimately everything that we turn into images is a departure from the reality that it refers to. So photography, illustration are departures from a reality. They're no longer reality, and yet they inform our conception of nature and our conception of reality. And furthermore, Ghirri is aware of the idea that maps are political and economic rationalizations of the land. They are not reality in themselves. They talk about money, they talk about capitalism, and they talk about how, in a sense, the monetary value, the political value in the life of the 1970s, and moreover so in today's life, always override any other kind of encounter or inform preempting the encounter. Then, of course, these images are enigmatic in so many other ways. There's this playfulness, the way in which the image is confused with reality, and in which the image is always a confusion of reality, or in which reality is always a collision of images that seem to be at times extremely easy, extremely snapshot-like. Like in this case, this is one of my favorite photographs, because you can see that Ghirri uses nature here as a representation of the mood of this couple. We don't know if they're waiting for their meal to be served, but you can see that they look pensive. Or maybe they just had an argument, and all of a sudden the bad waves that are painted in the background appears to perhaps hint at their mood. These connections that Ghirri sees, like in this case, the idea of preparing for a trip, looking at a map. This is what we will see anyway, the experience, the formation of the experience. And again, sunsets, a sublime subject that Ghirri feels has been trivialized by capitalism, consumerism, the touristic industry. This rack of postcards is multiplying all these sunsets, making them trivial, making them unnecessary, and removing one slot where no photograph appears, again, gives away the construction, the idea of what is a sunset and what is the experience of a sunset when sunsets have been charged with so many expectations. What is a good sunset? What is a sunset in your life, perhaps? And you can see here as well, again, how he plays with the fragmentation of photographs that have been taken by others in the context of advertising. Advertising is a strong presence in Ghirri's work. Some art historians have read this in the context of pop art. You can see it also in the way in which he integrates lettering that then again appears to be humorous, as well as perhaps questioning the nature of what it is that we are seeing by creating a redundancy. We can see what we are seeing. So the name of what we're seeing is unnecessary, superfluous. You can see here as well how he plays with these tropes of cinematic nature. There's almost a reminder here of The Sound of Music, the opening scene with Julie Andrews, and this fragmentation of the experience. In a sense, this image especially is a reminder that we have alienated ourselves so much from nature. It's such a distant reality for us that we can only ever return to nature as tourists, as visitors that can only be there temporarily and never really connect with the ecosystems and biosystems of nature beyond a certain point. And you can see this juxtaposition between the industrialization, the architectural growth that happens in Italy, and what is left of what we can call nature, pervading Ghirri's photography in his work throughout the 1980s as well. The framing, what's inside, what's outside, and of course the humor that perseveres in awkward moments. There is this idea that I reject, that Ghirri represented what seemed to be futile and what seemed to be irrelevant in order to elevate it. I think this is an art historical cliche that often applies to photography. And this is not, to me, what Ghirri is doing at all. His idea is not to elevate anything. And I think this is visible in his aesthetic. He's not trying to elevate the mundane. He's not trying to elevate what seemingly appears as irrelevant. I think he's trying to show us what he sees in ways that appear to him to be meaningful, to be what they are. And he tries to present them as relevant, not because they are always extraordinary, but actually because they are what makes life what it is. everyday things, everyday situations. And of course, this is a kind of a different sort of picture in that sense, of maybe one of his most iconic in the sense that it transgresses these ideas, which you can see here, a flood that becomes surreal. There's a sense of surrealism in some of Ghirri's photographs that allows the everyday to still be retained, to still be present, to still be part of the discourse. And I wanted to wrap up this exploration of the representation of nature in Ghirri's body of work with this image. This is the last photograph that was taken by Ghirri in 1992. And unfortunately died on the 14th of February. And at the age of 49, he had a heart attack. And it is a very emblematic photograph. Many critics agree that it's interesting. This should be a photograph of the landscape that preoccupied him the whole of his life. And at the same time, it's meaningful, even if incidentally, that this landscape disappears into the fog, which is in line with his approach to photography and this kind of openness of the image, the way in which the image seems to go on forever in this pattern that is just like linear and infinite and that just disappears. It's a very touching photograph and one that really, in a sense, underlines this sense of loneliness, this sense of alienation, this sense of wanting to connect and wanting to find some kind of balance, find some kind of possibility to instigate a new turn in this relationship that seems to be otherwise irreparably compromised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for this enlightening presentation of Luigi Ghirri's work. I would like to thank you for having mentioned Michelangelo Antonioni, a film director who was meant so much for the people of my age, and especially as you were mentioning the similar sense of alienation, of loneliness, of sadness that both artists convey. L'Avventura was released in 1960, so a few years prior to Ghirri's main work. And I would like also, what was interesting when you mentioned the decentralization of the human in Ghirri's work, I think it's possible to find it also in a way in Antonioni's films, while the mood that Antonioni wants to convey and to build makes the characters and the story, the plot, let's say, secondary.
Yes.
Just exactly. So it's a very similar thing to what happens as we observe one of Ghirri's pictures.
I agree. There's an interesting breaking down of the narrative in a kind of Hollywood sense, right? I mean, Antonioni, I don't want to say that he's an acquired taste, but at the same time, his films require a certain predisposition, right? And if you're hoping for action in the sense of entertainment, then there's not going to be any at all, or there's going to be very little of it. And you're right, Luca, there's this feeling that anthropocentrism is also sidelined in those films, in this avoidance. And sometimes I think Antonioni had such a beautiful eye for photography. There's a sense that his cinematography is almost like a long form photography or an expanded form of photography in which we are asked to look in the absence of dialogue for the purpose of getting a little deeper into whatever it is that's being represented. And it's fascinating to imagine that actually silence and what's perceived as the lack of something can be more meaningful than actually just filling the scene with a lot of loudness or a lot of content.
Yeah, and the other element that strikes me in parallelism between the two is the use of frames, the framing, because you see in Ghirri, we see shut doors, we see windows, we see fences, and in a way, this is a secondary frame beside the usual rectangle of the photo that, in a way, directs and the viewer, and then stops time. You know, so there's a very powerful framing, and this happens as well in some Antonioni's sequences, especially in La Ventura, with the landscape of the island in part of the film. So also, I think this visual, as you just mentioned, this visual parallelism between the two is quite evident, and in the way they end up like trying to convey the same message and a very similar reflection on contemporary society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how if you've experienced that too. But I have memories of the kind of Milanese suburbia when I grew up being, and I don't want to insult anybody, but being a kind of like soulless place. There is something about it that wasn't quite adding up. Even as a child, you can tell. And my parents is not, I'm not from a wealthy background, so we lived in a interesting area of Milan because it was historic on the canals. But at the time when I was growing up, now it's the trendiest area in Milan on the Navigli. But back in the days, it was actually a place to avoid where you get mugged all the time. And still, I could perceive more of a kind of community, more of a sense of belonging in that reality than in whatever I experienced in these architectures of suburbia that looked soulless, very cold, the shutters always being down or most often being down, the silence, the quietness. I don't know if you have an experience of that.
Yes, I do, because it was a very similar when we used to go out of town and cross the suburbia. So I still have a very strong memory of this feeling of suspension.
Right, it's a suspended living, right?
And one more thing that you mentioned reminded me of something that I read in an interview of Ghirri. You were mentioning that he was accused, say, of elevating the futile. And actually, I would say that he said that his favorite trips were in a 3 kilometers radius out of his home, because that's where he would find daily objects, daily views, where he could stop his eye and find new or real meanings to those futile objects, and that we're able to.
I think there's a lesson there, because especially at the time we live in, where everyone's attention is like pulled in different directions by their phones and everything else that you can imagine. We are becoming so much more desensitized to anything around us that it's not yelling at us, that it's not grabbing our attention in ways that are sublime or particularly exciting at the outset. And I think there's something really fascinating in this invitation to look at your local reality, to look at your surroundings, and to find what is exciting or interesting or engaging in whatever way it's meaningful to you, in something that is just there and that doesn't have to be special, but nonetheless that is special, not because it needs to be made special, but it's special in what it has to say right there. When I look at the images, and again, I recommend this beautiful book, you can actually see the whole series of photographs in the book. There's really a feeling of, I don't know how else somebody could capture that feeling that you and I are describing here of alienation and loneliness, silence, the suspended feeling of suburbia than these pictures do. And it comes out of taking pictures of plants and realities that most of us have been trained to overlook and have been trained to consider irrelevant. I think in a sense, this is also a broader metaphor of our malaise and our bad relationship with nature. Ghirri represents this inability, like his pictures represent this inability to find what is interesting in the mundane. We have not been prepared to be open to that. And then, of course, nature, whatever that word might mean, disappears and crumbles. And we only see it in the Alps. We only see it in the deep forests. And I think there is something there about this sense of loneliness, this alienation that these photographs really represent particularly well.
Before we wrap up, because we've been very late.
Yes,
but it's been a very interesting conversation. I would like just to suggest to you a reflection of Sandra. She says that Ghirri's work especially reminds her of the disappearance of rural life in Italy in the 50s, and she thinks of Fernando Camon's Cicli degli Ultimi.
Yeah, I think there is are you reading Sandra's?
Yeah.
Yes, there's something interesting there, and there's of course a lot more that I look forward to research further in the ways in which not just the images of plants that Ghirri has put together in Colazione sull'erba, but also in the broader sense of his body of work. I think what he's trying to capture, I'm not sure about the pushing one to the future in fascism, as well as probably beyond, past fascism. That's also part of the identity crisis. I've spoken other times about the identity crisis that pervades Italy following the Second World War, which is due in part to the deep fascist brainwashing that preceded the war, and then the demise of that process, which left a void. And I think the life that is allowed to develop in the Italian suburbia of cities like Milan, Bologna, as well as the other big cities of the north, as well as Rome, it gets complicated in different local realities, is certainly the result of that moment. And it can be explored in so many different ways. I read Sandra's actually in the note from Lou says, the suburbia is a post-fascist presentation of this anxiety. Absolutely. That's certainly one of the ways in which it can be looked at. I don't know that we should, I don't want to necessarily only contextualize it as a post-fascist, because I think the trauma that Italy went through in that post-fascist moment is also related to what Antonioni discusses in his interview, which is technology, and how technology has alienated us from nature, how the rhythms of technology have alienated us from the passing of time, and a rhythm that perhaps is more congenial to live the present in a fuller way. There is a sense of emptiness, I think, in those images and in that suburbia that speaks of this psychological dimension really well.
Yes, I fully agree with you, especially on this last comment. As we wrap up, I would like to see who we talked about landscapes and travels, for a little suggestion for your spring and summer travels to Italy. Actually, the city of Modena, Parma, and Reggio Emilia have dedicated the whole year 2022 to the celebration of Luigi Ghirri, and they have organized a series of events, exhibitions, conversation dedicated to this artist, and that go under the name of Vedere Oltre. And if you scroll up the chat, I posted the website, the link to this series of events that I suggest everyone to visit, and I will definitely do so as soon as I get the chance to go back to Italy. So I will see you all on the 21st of April to the third step on this path in the exploration of nature in arts, with a conversation with Professor Giovanni, dedicated to Giuseppe Pennone and the context of Arte Povera. In the meanwhile, I thank everyone again, and I wish you a very nice evening. Thank you again, Giovanni. See
Thank you
you
very
next
much, Luca.
time.
Thank you, everyone.